Welcome to After School Democracy, the podcast that attempts to fill in the gaps you almost certainly missed in school about politics, economics, and history. I found it quite shocking and a bit odd when my far-left friends started posting memes and funny quotes about guillotines and the rich. I just couldn't put my finger on why. Listening to the Revolutions podcast, I now can remember why. People who think of the guillotines as purely a way to kill tyrants and the wealthy have only had a glancing look at history. It killed some tyrants and lords, including the king and his wife, for income inequality, but it was a combo of direct action, mob rule, and legislative government that caused that. However, most of the people killed through mob rule, via the guillotine, were just hapless people swept up in the violence, while there was a trial for the real rich nobles who perpetuated income inequality. The mob never used the guillotine. They used a gang of people with stabby knives and beaten sticks to kill them en masse after holding a kangaroo court. The French Revolution would probably have to start with King Louis XIV, who changed up the social order of things to prevent the lords from rebelling, and set up his court in Versailles and required them to come to him and dote on him, meaning they spent less time with their actual peasants and became socially disconnected from them. This kind of social economic isolation is something you see more and more of today, so that especially the super rich can't relate to the rest of us in any real way. They just know for certain they are superior and worked harder, and the rest of us are just lazy. In exchange for them coming to him, he spent enormous sums of money to show off his grandeur and parties for all the rich elites. What people didn't know after he died is that he was pretty much doing this all on the nation's credit card, and now his son Louis XV had to deal with the debt. Of course, that debt just got dumped harshly on the peasants, and the lords wanted to keep their lifestyles they had grown accustomed to. Jacques Necker was a popular treasury minister and figured out how to cook the books and make it look like he had balanced the debt when he actually hadn't, and became a very popular figure. He also failed to realize just how little the rich paid their taxes, so the money he thought he was getting turned out to be wrong. After losing money and land in the 7 Years' War of the French and Indian War to the Americans, Necker told the king that they would make plenty of money helping the Americans with their revolution for independence. They did not. When this all became public, Necker was replaced with Joseph-François Foulon, who had to seriously pull back on spending and change up the tax structure, which made him unpopular to everyone, especially since there was a seriously bad season of farming, so he got the boot. This cycle kept happening. New changes, bad season, the finance minister trying anything they could to enact new ways to stabilize the debt, and then the peasants got mad, and the lords pressured the king to replace that person, and this new guy had to try things. Because of this, finally, Louis XVI began increasing representation in the parliament and allowing for representative democracy from the bourgeois class. As things got worse and people from non-noble families gained more power, along with local priests, who got power in the parliament as opposed to the rich, fat, corrupt cardinals and bishops, the parliament was able to pressure the king to give more and more rights and representations to the people. And by people, we mean rich people. This was all for fear of the violence of the masses. After one very intense breakthrough, the right of the people to print and have free speech finally happened, and subversive and critical papers circulated freely. This caused a lot of liberal, new revolutionary ideas to float around. After a time, the people of Paris all marched to Versailles, and through threat of force, but few deaths, forced the king and his family to come to Paris. They also used the same tactic in Parliament multiple times when they dared threaten the revolution. The fact that Paris was a hub of proto-proletariat laborers and artisans was so near Versailles is why it succeeded. Direct action works locally, not so much nationally unless everybody all over the nation is in on it. Most other cities were pro-monarchist, but since Paris was near enough to the proximity to use direct action, they decided where France went. Upon the execution of the king, the rest of the nation's cities weren't happy. For a while there, things went relatively well. The Jacobins tried their damnedest to pull together and enact the Constitution of 1793, the most egalitarian constitution that has ever been put forth. However, war leaves nothing pure. The monarchical European powers invaded France, and their volunteer army actually beat back the invading force, something no one expected or had heard of in the rest of Europe. However, the Commission for Public Safety began using very heavy-handed methods at the time. prominent revolutionary writers began pushing the public opinion further and further radical. These ideas themselves were great, but they called anyone who didn't change their minds fast enough enemies of the revolution and traitors to it. Maximilien Robespierre, from what historians can tell, suffered a complete nervous breakdown, and when he came back from leave, the sweeping witch hunt for people without the right speak and right think, who didn't change their speech fast enough or denounce others fast enough, ended up losing their heads to Madame la Guillotine. Literally no one was safe. Kangaroo courts were set up, and people were given the blade just for paranoid suspicions of disloyalty and not saying and doing the 100% right gesture to virtue signal their loyalty to the revolution. At the end, in total, 16,000 had been beheaded from all different levels of society. No, the guillotine's real role that should be remembered for the most is the horrendous danger of runaway purity culture, something ironically the far left, especially online, is radicalized with, but sadly it leaks over into people in real life. In France during the Revolution, during the Reign of Terror, everyone went into a frenzy and daring to question leadership or lapses in saying or doing the right displays of patriotic zeal, even if it didn't actually show it led you, no matter how loyal, to the guillotine. The curse of victory ended up having people immediately turn on each other when they had previously fought for solidarity to achieve big things. What should have been continued to be a free and fair republic with the most progressive and liberty-based constitution of its time, the Constitution of 1793, set it aside for dictatorship in the argument of we have to defend the revolution dogma by curbing freedom of people who disagreed with us. Failure in the ministry was not tolerated, even when the people appointed tried to object to leadership positions because they were not qualified for the job, and the guillotine killed generals left and right like Vader in Empire Strikes Back. No one was safe, and to keep one's own head, a person had to go even more radical in purity culture, which led to others being killed. No one was safe. Only the ones with the best ability to convince others that someone else isn't pure enough to the dogma, and when things calmed down a bit, it swung back in the other direction, with anything to the left dragged through the mud, and Napoleon got the power to become a dictator. The only time the guillotine was used for real justice was by a democratically elected government, until democracy was stripped for purity culture. This also happened in the Russian Revolution, and a dictator came to power in the dogma and in name alone of communism, just as France used the dogma of patriotism and fraternity. Madame Guillotine is the perfect symbol for them, purity culture, only a passing understanding of history and blind rage of mob rule. That is why their use of this symbol scared me a bit, and they continue to somewhat scare me. They show the signs of the beginning of runaway radicalism. I like to listen to leftists because they have a different perspective and know ideas I never heard of because of our Red Scare destruction of other points of view and political history that was wiped from our collective memory, also through a witch hunt. I fucking hate listening to leftists because their political tactics and lack of realism and ability to explain things to the average person who don't think in the same anachronistic languages like they do and don't understand that the current political demographic still has to change or their ideas would be a dictatorship of the minority. As by last count, around maybe 8% would consider them leftists in America, while 55% of them fear and hate leftism or anything resembling it. Just a note, 8% is still less than the number of people who believe the moon landing was faked. So yeah, it's no surprise really that the Democratic Party isn't taking them that seriously. They are also some of the most smug, self-righteous, absolutist, judgy, and puritanical bastards you would ever like to meet, just like the religious right, seeming to be completely devoid of nuance and how psychology works. People like Thought Slime on YouTube, who seems to mostly understand this, who are a rare gem, are great to listen to because he believes that anarchism should only come about when the people are ready and educated enough to choose it for themselves. He knows it's going to be a long, slow uphill march to change people's mind, which is why I'm on board with many of his ideas, even if I disagree with him 10% of the time, and see him as slightly conspiratorial on occasion. Sadly, most are in their own bubble and think that they are right and everyone else is complicit in injustice, even though we are all constantly working and awakening ourselves to much of the knowledge that was lost or actively suppressed and trying to build the airplane in mid-flight while they angrily attack us and vilify us, and nothing is ever good enough for them, even after the biggest victory. The goalpost is instantly moved exponentially further as to why their victory sucked and was actually just helping the status quo. And these are the people, such purity culture, They would happily get swept up in the frothing fury of the Reign of Terror in France, the Great Purge in Russia, and the Cultural Revolution in China. We need to be able to access leftist thinking in safe spaces, which some have been able to figure out, because the human brain absorbs it better that way, but Jesus Christ, leftists, if you gain the same puritanical stick-up-your-ass image that the religious right has, you will do yourself no favors, and people will fear you even gaining power for fear of seeing another reign of terror, and in America, that mindset is already ingrained into people who hate and fear anything leftist at all. This kind of purity culture is really what the guillotine stands for. Only a few rich people lost their heads. The froth and purity culture and requirement to denounce the right thing at the right time and call out people if you get called out for being pure enough took the most heads in the Reign of Terror. And that's all the alt-right wants. After the Reign of Terror, there was so much hatred of Jacobins, there was a backswing of right-wing fury, and it sent them to war with all their neighbors in a George W. Bush-style war of liberation. They are using purity culture as a way to discredit any progressive and leftist thinking. If a person doesn't have time to keep up with the internet purity culture online because they're working their asses off in this capitalist economy to keep themselves alive, but their heart is in the right place, that's not good enough. They're human garbage and just as evil as Nazis. At which point, you've alienated yourself and no one wants anything to do with you, and you can't really make any change and probably cause most of the people you encounter to dig in their heels further. The only point of guilt is to drive change in yourself, and only we can really have that guilt in ourselves unless we came from an abusive relationship. The only point of fear is self-preservation. The only point of anger is action. Anger doesn't help anyone learn anything unless you are turning that anger into action beyond hating on someone for not using the correct right think and right speak. Unless you know how to educate and build consensus, all of your anger and hate is useless in a democracy of any kind. Guess what? We are all wrong about so many things. How we fix that is a journey and a process. We change and learn when we feel safe. We don't do it because some stranger tells us we're horrible human beings and essentially just as bad as Nazis. The reason it took the leftist intellectuals in Russia so long to reach the peasants for nearly half a century and still weren't that great at it was because they wanted to live in their own little bubbles and not actually interact with the people they disagreed with. The Marxist class have changed. The blue-collar and service workers are the modern proletariat and peasant. They are the most anti-leftist and make up the majority. The internet has created a bubble cult of echo chambers, so you don't have to talk to people who disagree with you, and you can whittle down your interactions to only people you mostly agree with, and you get swept up in the bandwagon effect of purity culture, and while you certainly believe you came about it from your own rationale, that's what the bandwagon effect bias tells you. It flips time periods when you actually decided to believe it because it made you feel part of the group, and then learned enough to rationalize it, enough to make it make sense to you. It's now your identity. It may be 100% true, but your reason for believing it is unfounded and wrong. It's why I was a Ron Pauler, and why I'm so slow to embrace leftist thinking because of it. Like libertarianism, it's a worldview lens that simplifies everything, so it seems like it explains everything. Of course, leftism is way more complicated than that, but most are too ignorant of the details, so the bad actors in the group can warp and divide the idea and make you hate anyone who disagrees with you, and blocks all historical and neurological and psychological context. And these bad actors are parroting things like, voting doesn't do anything, only direct action does, and it's my liberal white privilege that makes you say just vote. No, you strawmanning idiot. You elect the people who will go the furthest, especially locally, and then using direct action, push them beyond that. These people are in every leftist conversation feed, acting like you're the privileged one if you dare say that voting has even the slightest impact on the world, and these people were part of the reason why we have Trump today. Kids were forcefully separated from their parents to be locked in cages, and 200,000 will probably be dead from COVID-19 by the time this video is made in the US. Sure, you can keep using the guillotine to humorously threaten the rich. Please do, but keep in mind that that edge could be used on you like it did in France if you don't virtue signal enough and can't keep your head in the constant internet age to angrily attack anyone who slightly has wrong think. Get out of the internet bubble, engage with people who disagree with the principle of charity, and be open to the possibility that you yourself may be wrong. People don't change or learn from being attacked angrily at all. That's not how brains work, not even a little. So thank you so much for joining me on my podcast. I'm sure there was nothing controversial about this, and everyone will happily get along in the comments section, which you can do on the YouTube version of this video, or my Facebook page, After School Democracy. Link in the show notes. Just a reminder that I'm Anubis2814 on YouTube, and I have over 500 videos on different topics that I've made over the past 10 years. Please subscribe, and if your podcast site has the option, give me a like or review. If you think what I have to say informed you, consider supporting my Patreon. I'll be doing this podcast weekly and try to get it out on the same day, so I hope to see you here next week, ready to be filled with new ideas. Take care. This channel is helped tremendously by the generous supporters on Patreon. A big thank you to the wonderful Joe Taylor, Elias Garcia Guevara, and Ogrel for their support at the $10 a month Wapawet level. Please consider donating to my work if you can, and thank you all for listening.